first off, let's just establish the basics before getting into the meat of what we were talking about yesterday and this overall conversation. So in your own words, what is a democracy?
Well, I think the question is, should laws be made by people you've elected to make those laws? And that's really the essence of a democracy, unless you have a direct democracy, which is very rare in the modern world. But you do get referendums sometimes. But essentially, laws are made by people you elect. And that's really the essence of what's been happening with Roe versus Wade. People who were advocating for abortion rights in the 1960s couldn't make sufficient progress, perhaps unsurprisingly, in all of the US states, when you think back to social attitudes in the 1960s. So they sort of found a way of circumventing it by going to a very sympathetic Supreme Court, and getting a right almost invented that exists in the Constitution, though nobody can actually find the words in the Constitution that create that right, to abortion, but not an unrestricted right. I think we have to be clear about that. Roe versus Wade never created an unrestricted right to abortion. It never created abortion on demand. But it said the states couldn't criminalize abortion prior to viability, effectively, something like that. So the result of that was that the states were still making laws democratically about when you could have an abortion and when you couldn't. But there was also another consequence of it, which was that a lot of people felt, in a sense, that this was a maneuver which had cheated them of their vote. And I think that added a great deal of bitterness to the abortion debate ever since. Now, what happened yesterday was that you see a lot of stuff on Twitter about how the Supreme Court has banned abortion and so on. The Supreme Court simply said yesterday that constitutional right doesn't exist and was never there. So it is a matter for democratic legislatures to make laws about, and they might, being states, they can make different laws from each other. But there's also the scope for a federal law. So you could have a federal law made by Congress that would cover the whole of the United States on abortion. In fact, there's even a theory, I don't know if it's true, that the leaking of the draft Alito judgment was to some extent deliberate, to give Congress the opportunity to legislate Roe versus Wade into law before the judgment was delivered. And indeed, there has been a bill in Congress to legalize abortion, but instead of simply legislating for Roe versus Wade, it was loaded up with a whole load of other things, to the point that even some Democrat politicians were saying they couldn't vote for it. So, there are opportunities still there. For the politicians being cynical, this now makes it a midterm election question. And so this will be on the, there are midterm elections coming in November. And this will be a political issue. And all I was saying initially was that that's good. It's much, much better in a democracy that these things are decided by the votes of the people than that they're decided by judges behind closed doors, especially on very ropey grounds.
In those midterms, you and I both know that Americans will vote on obviously more than one issue. They'll vote on a broad range of issues. So when a broad majority of Americans, I believe it's 66% in a recent survey, said they didn't want the complete overruling of Roe versus Wade, how is it democratic for 9 people to come to a decision to do that on behalf of just under 330 million people?
Well, we don't measure our democracies on opinion polls. I mean, this is just not relevant in a democratic society. We have democratic structures, we have elections, we have balance of powers and things like that, and we have divisions of responsibilities. Even in the UK, we now have devolution. In America, they don't have devolution because power is passed upwards rather than downwards from the states up to the federal government. But they have things that they are responsible for at the state level, and they have structures for electing people. And we saw recently when Donald Trump tried to get different attorney generals to change votes in his favor, that these election results are pretty robust and pretty accurate, and it's not possible. So we know America is a functioning democracy, and votes are actually counted and decisions are made on that basis. And some states, of course, allow ballots on important topics as well, so you have referendums. So that's the level at which this will mostly be decided. But if it's absolutely true that 66% of the population want Roe versus Wade, they have opportunities to vote for that. They will have candidates. And I agree with you, of course, in an election, people vote on a broad range of issues. But I don't think you should underestimate the salience of this issue in American politics. This issue is clearly not just one issue as opposed to another. For a lot of people on both sides, this is the number one issue, and it will be driving votes in these midterm elections and in state elections and beyond.
I think what people find hard to weigh up and balance is that you say you want democracy, which is defined as a way of governing on the will of the people, but you say opinion polls don't matter, but when only 34% of the population would want the complete overruling of something that has now been overruled, I don't understand how that can balance up with being a democratic decision.
Because an opinion poll doesn't have any electoral, constitutional or legal weight. Secondly, we know that opinion polls depend on how you frame questions. Thirdly, we know that opinion polls that are commissioned by one particular side of an argument, and this is not just on abortion, it's on other things, amazingly show supportive results for that side of the argument. And then you get another opinion poll on a similar topic with a slightly different question a week later, commissioned by somebody else who doesn't share that view. And amazingly, that shows a different sort of result altogether. So, opinion polls can be manipulated, the results can be manipulated, and they're not a basis on which we make decisions. America now has a choice. Americans, I should say, now have choices which they didn't have before. And they have democratic mechanisms for expressing those choices. You will undoubtedly end up, I'm sure, with a patchwork of provision. In some states, there'll be no provision. In others, there will be generous provision. This is not actually, in principle, very different from what exists in the European Union. Abortion law is different from one European Union state to another. I know we're not part of the European Union anymore. For example, it's much more difficult to get an abortion in Germany than it would be in the United Kingdom. The EU hasn't fallen apart over this. People accept that provision is going to be different from one place to another. No country in the European Union that I can think of, and certainly not the United Kingdom, has a constitutional right to abortion. No country allows abortion on demand. For lots of people, like Keir Starmer said yesterday, abortion is a basic human right. It's not a human right. It doesn't appear in the UN Convention on Human Rights. It doesn't appear in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It doesn't appear in the European Convention of Human Rights. It isn't a human right in the sense that it's an entrenched right, a constitutional right in the United Kingdom, nor is it in any EU country I know. So in every one of those countries, the state, the legislature, restricts access to abortion, and you can't have it in certain circumstances. Do people think that we allow sex-selective abortion in this country? I'm not sure if we do, but I very much hope we don't.
I don't believe so. Many would say that healthcare is a basic human right, and they would say that abortion falls under healthcare. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, I don't actually. I mean, abortion can be a healthcare issue if the mother's life is under threat. Of course, it can, but it can also be a lifestyle issue, and I think everyone, even pro-abortion people, accept that. It can be it covers a range of choices. I'm not arguing with people. My argument is with people who think that this is somehow sorry, start again. What I want to say is that the legal rights that women have to abortion in this country, in Britain, are rights that have been given to them by Parliament through a democratic process. They're not universal rights. They're not unrestricted rights. They can be amended. They are the subject of change from time to time. And that's the position that America is now in. So people who believe that a woman has an absolute right to choose and that there should be abortion on demand, they're perfectly entitled to those beliefs, but that isn't what exists. And no politician is actually advocating that, as far as I know. No politician is advocating it, and nobody wants to think through the consequences. One of the reasons is people don't want to think through the consequences of it, which is that you could have sex-selective abortion. And, well, we already have now abortion up to birth for disabled babies. I mean, a lot of people would find that disturbing, but apparently it's allowed now.
Right, I've not heard that, so I'm not 100% on the facts of that. I've not heard of abortions at birth. So the comment I made on Twitter where I said, stop telling women what to do with their bodies, you said that's exactly what the Supreme Court has done. How is that so?
Well, the Supreme Court has taken itself out of telling people what to do with their bodies. That's the point.
How have they told people what to do?
The Supreme Court was deeply in this from 1973 until yesterday. It was the principal lawmaker. And it had the effect that politicians, elected politicians, could duck out of difficult issues. What the Supreme Court has done is to say, we're getting out of this. We're no longer telling people what to do with their bodies. There isn't a constitutional right. Don't talk to us anymore. We're going home. Goodbye.
How did the Supreme Court tell people what to do with their bodies?
Well, they were involved. They involved themselves in abortion law. Is what I meant. And now they are taking themselves out of abortion law, at least on the question of the constitutional right. There are other ancillary issues that I'm sure will come to the Supreme Court.
So just to clear that up, the Supreme Court didn't tell people what to do with their bodies. It simply allowed them the opportunity and choice to opt for an abortion if that's what they desired.
Yeah, and now they've taken themselves out of that.
Why should where an American woman lives determine her right to a choice?
Well, that's where people live in a democracy. Why should where a European Union citizen, female citizen, live determine her right to an abortion? Because you have a patchwork of provision. And because the right is a right that derives not from some universal standard, but derives from parliamentary legislation in each of the competent states.
Do you believe that a woman should be able to move from a state in which abortion may be banned to one next door, have an abortion where it's legal, and then come back home?
Well, I think that's going to be one of the issues that could well come in America, could come to the Supreme Court. Because I think there may be, I don't know this for a fact, but I read that there may be some states who try to introduce such a ban. And I personally think such a ban is probably wrong and unenforceable. But I suspect that would be a matter that would, when I said there were ancillary matters that would probably come to the Supreme Court eventually, that was one that I was thinking of. As far as European Union countries are concerned, I think, I don't know what the position is. I think it's for each country to regulate for itself. If somebody from Germany turns up in France demanding, asking for an abortion, or any other sort of medical procedure, surgical procedure, I don't know what France's response to that is. I mean, there's a universal health scheme. There's those EII cards that we used to have before we left the EU that guarantees some sort of free medical treatment. Does that cover abortion? I genuinely don't know. I mean, I'd have to ask.
Do you believe that American state leaders should hold off on introducing any new legislation until these midterms because they were elected under Roe versus Wade still being enacted?
Well, they're not doing that. Obviously, some of them are enacting it already.
They're not, no. What do you think, though? Do you think they should hold off?
Well, I don't know, because to be perfectly honest, I don't know if the midterm elections I'm talking about are at congressional level. Mm-hmm. I don't know which of these, the cycle on which these states have their own elections for their own legislatures. So maybe they're all happening in November and maybe they're not. I don't know. And they elect in different methods. So I wouldn't put that down to the states. Congress did have a chance, as I say, to legislate on Roe versus Wade over the last few weeks, and hasn't managed to do so.
Why don't you think they did that?
I think it's clear why they didn't do it, because if you legislate for Roe versus Wade, it's quite a restricted right it contains. It's not a right for on-demand, unrestricted abortion, as I said at the outset. And I think what happened was that pro-abortion activists, senators and congressmen, added extra things in to try and make the right more expansive, to the point that it became so expansive that even some Democrat legislatures were saying publicly, I can't vote for this. Mm-hmm. So I think they pushed too far and tried to enact something which was what the other side would call too extreme, and it fell. But what is also interesting is that I think actually there was politics in that, and I think they were quite happy that it fell, because it creates a midterm issue on which the Democrats might now do better than they would simply standing up and defending Joe Biden, which is a sticky wicket for them.
Right. And you are pro-life. You said you're pro-life.
Yes.
If a woman is likely to die giving birth, should she be allowed an abortion? Where do you stand on that?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Yes. And indeed, I saw the woman from the Lieutenant Governor of Arkansas saying that even Arkansas, which passed its legislation yesterday, signed its legislation, one of the trigger states, said even in Arkansas, a woman would be entitled to an abortion if her life was threatened.
In recent months, you have been a staunch supporter of the Prime Minister, despite everything that's been going on. He did whip his MPs to vote against free school meals, which obviously helps impoverished children. What is pro-life about that?
Well, I mean, I don't think free school meals, I'm sorry, you mean the provision of free school meals in summer holidays? Mm-hmm. Okay. So the free school meals are still available to those who are entitled to them when they're at school. And it's always been accepted that during the holidays, parents have a responsibility as well. And I don't see this as a life issue at all. But if you believe the state should take over more and more of the responsibilities of parents, so that the state is actually the provider for all children, then you're getting into a Brave New World type scenario where you might as well, you've got the whole Aldous Huxley vision where people don't even have babies anymore.
Surely it's up to the state to help. Surely it's up to the state more than ever to help now when we're in this cost of living crisis.
I think the state should help in a targeted way. Yes, I think there are other things we should be doing as well that the government isn't doing that are more important to getting us out of the cost of living crisis. But I hadn't come on particularly to talk about free school meals, and I haven't been asked to vote on it as far as I'm aware in the House of Lords. But I think there are serious questions. What are the responsibilities of parents, and how much should the state substitute for them?
Right. The House of Lords is an interesting topic. A lot of people would say that your love for democracy is in direct conflict with you accepting a peerage and the title.
Yeah, they're right. I mean, there's no arguing back on that. There's no way of saying, oh, no, the House of Lords is really, truly a democratic body. You just don't realize how democratic it is. It's not a democratically appointed body. I mean, it operates democratically inside its own walls, that we all have one vote and no more. But you're absolutely right. It's not a democratically appointed body. And the only justification for continuing with the House of Lords is that it does a very good job on the whole of scrutinizing and amending legislation. And you would need some chamber to do that anyway.
Do you think there should be reform surrounding the House of Lords?
I'm not advocating it, because I think you could tie yourself up in knots for years, as governments have in the past, every time you come up with a proposal for reform. So everyone can agree there should be reform, and nobody can agree what the reform should be. And you can tie yourself up in knots. But I fully accept that if there is a mandate to reform the House of Lords, that it should be reformed. And I wouldn't resist doing that. The danger from the point of view of our political system is that if you had a fully elected House of Lords, it would start claiming the same authority as the House of Commons. And really no European country that has a two-tier system really works on that basis. In all of them, the upper house is weaker. And that weakness is reflected in the way it's chosen. So in Ireland, for example, you have an upper house, the Senate, which is partly appointed by the Prime Minister, partly appointed by certain great state corporations, and partly elected by county councillors. So clearly its democratic mandate is not as strong as the lower house. And so in any fight between the two, the lower house can claim that mandate. That happens in the UK as well. So the fear would be if you had a completely, I'd be up for a completely elected House of Lords if that's what you wanted. I mean, I wouldn't object to that at all. But then you'd have this lack of this imbalance, or you wouldn't have an imbalance. What you want is an imbalance. And you'd end up with deadlock. And no Commons politician has ever been willing to vote for that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lord Moylan.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending some time with me this morning.
Not at all. I hope that's